In a time not so long ago, an unspeakable darkness shrouded the land. A chapter of history, buried beneath the weight of silence, emerges from the depths of time, waiting to be unveiled. We all know the story of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, the inhumane treatment, and eventual abolition. But what if I told you that the darkest chapter of this history remains untold, hidden away from the pages of your textbooks? Today, we embark on a journey to unveil the unspeakable, to illuminate the darkest corners of a history that's been kept in the shadows, a history of cruelty beyond imagination. As we dive deep into the annals of time, we will expose a sinister secret, a truth that schools fail to teach you about the Black experience. The abolition of the slave trade in the early 19th century brought forth a new, even more sinister aspect of slavery. Welcome to the world of sex farms and slave breeding, a grotesque practice that defies comprehension. These farms, hidden away in the heart of the southern United States, served as breeding grounds for human beings. It's a story of commodification, a story of unimaginable suffering. But don't avert your eyes, for the darkness must be faced, the horrors acknowledged. In this video, we bring you 10 horrifying facts that history tried to forget. Facts that are not just tales of the past, but mirrors reflecting the persistent shadows that still loom over the present. Get ready to confront the unimaginable, to journey into the depths of the unsung stories that have shaped a nation. Join us as we shine a light on a history that must not be forgotten, a history that must be known to pave the path towards justice and healing. And so, let's begin with fact number 1. Fact 1. Enslaved women as breeding machines. Fact number 1 reveals the horrifying truth that enslaved women were seen as little more than breeding machines. They were exploited in a way that's beyond comprehension, as plantation owners and overseers saw them merely as a means to produce more enslaved people. Imagine being stripped of your autonomy and reduced to a mere vessel for someone else's profit. Enslaved women across the Deep South, where the demand for enslaved labor was exceptionally high, were subjected to this dehumanizing reality. They were forced to have sex with multiple men, regardless of their own desires or consent. The Deep South, with its ideal climate and soil for cotton cultivation, became a hotbed for this despicable practice. Enslaved women on these plantations faced brutal physical and sexual abuse with no hope of escape or justice. They were not regarded as human beings, but as property, their bodies treated as commodities. The evidence for the forced breeding of enslaved women is found in the painful remnants of history, including plantation records that reference them as breeders. These records detail the number of children they were forced to bear, their age, health, and other pertinent information. Enslaved women's stories further illuminate the horror. In her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman from North Carolina, recounts the nightmarish experience of being forced into sexual relations with her owner to produce children. The first fact sheds light on the inhumanity of reducing women to mere vessels for profit, and it sets the stage for the even more harrowing truths we'll uncover as we continue this journey. So, with heavy hearts, we transition to fact number 2, where we delve even deeper into the horrors of sexual exploitation. Fact 2. Female slaves forced into sexual relationships. Fact number 2 exposes the pervasive sexual exploitation of female slaves during the era of American slavery. These women not only endured forced labor, but also became victims of sexual abuse by their owners and overseers. This practice was not confined to any specific region, but was a dark reality across the American South. The distressing history of sexual abuse began during the transatlantic slave trade. Female slaves, already subjected to the horrors of the Middle Passage, were further violated by the crew members and male slaves on the treacherous journey. Once in the American South, this sexual abuse persisted, taking various forms such as rape, forced sexual relationships, and even prostitution. Owners and overseers abused their authority, coercing slave women into sexual relationships that were often violent and non-consensual. The consequences were dire. These women were impregnated against their will, and their offspring were considered the property of their owners rather than the children of their fathers. It meant that these children too were condemned to the life of a slave, their fate determined from birth. This heinous practice was particularly common in the Upper South, where slaves were bred for sale to the Lower South, perpetuating the cycle of brutality. One poignant example is the story of Sally Hemings, a slave woman owned by Thomas Jefferson. Hemings was forced into a sexual relationship with Jefferson, and she gave birth to 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. Although these children were not recognized as Jefferson's during his lifetime, DNA evidence later confirmed their paternity. Another horrifying case is that of Celia, a slave woman owned by Robert Newsom in Missouri. Newsom repeatedly raped Celia, and when she became pregnant, he refused to acknowledge the child as his own. Celia's desperate act of self-defense led to her trial, conviction of murder, and execution. These stories are agonizing reminders of the sexual abuse and violence that countless slave women endured in the American South. This was a brutal aspect of slavery, a reality that is crucial to acknowledge as we strive to understand the full extent of its inhumanity. Fact 3. Separation of offspring on sex farms. In this fact, we explore the heartbreaking practice of separating families on sex farms. The breeding of enslaved people created a brutal system where children born in these conditions were treated as commodities, leading to their separation from their families. Enslaved women who were forced to breed were often impregnated by men who were not their husbands or partners. As a result, the children produced on these sex farms were not part of a nuclear family unit, but rather considered products to be sold for profit. Plantation owners recognized the potential for profit in these enslaved children. Their price varied based on age, gender, and health, but they were generally sold for a higher price than adult enslaved individuals. This was because children had the potential to grow up and become productive laborers and future breeders themselves. The sale of these enslaved children happened at public auctions, where they would be cruelly separated from their mothers and other family members. The auctions were deeply traumatic for those being sold and those left behind. The cries of enslaved families, torn apart during these auctions, echoed across the auction platforms. Enslaved people wailed, sobbed, and screamed as they reached for children, parents, and lovers who were being sold away from them. The separation of families on sex farms had long-lasting, devastating effects. Children who were sold away from their mothers often faced a lifetime of trauma and loss. Parents who were forced to give up their children lived with the enduring pain of that separation. The history of these family separations on sex farms is a stark reminder of the inhumane nature of this system. It's a painful part of the legacy of slavery that we must confront as we move forward. Fact 4. Rewards for enslaved men who impregnated women. Fact number 4 unveils a shocking aspect of the slave breeding system, where plantation owners rewarded enslaved men who impregnated multiple women. It may be unfathomable to think of people being rewarded for impregnating multiple women, but this was indeed a reality on some sex farms during slavery. Plantation owners offered incentives to enslaved men who could produce the most offspring, destined for profit. This perverse practice further dehumanized enslaved people and reinforced their status as property rather than individuals with autonomy. In some cases, plantation owners even pitted enslaved men against each other in competitions to impregnate the most women. Such competitions not only caused harm to the enslaved women forced to participate in this horrific system, but also created a toxic environment among the enslaved men themselves. One chilling example comes from the diary of James Hammond, a plantation owner who boasted about the fertility of enslaved women. Hammond offered rewards to enslaved men who could impregnate the most women, considering it a great stimulus for them. This type of behavior is morally reprehensible, and it left a lasting scar on the enslaved people who were forced to take part in this degrading system. The offspring produced during these competitions were often sold as soon as they were weaned, leading to the painful separation of families and further dehumanization. Fact 5. Preferential treatment for good breeders. In number 5, we explore how enslaved women were treated based on their perceived value as breeders. This harrowing aspect of the slave breeding system sheds light on the dehumanization of enslaved people and its lasting impact. The breeding of enslaved people was a ruthless economic strategy, and enslaved women were viewed as reproductive machines. Their ability to bear children became a significant factor in determining their value. Women who were deemed good breeders were highly valued and received preferential treatment. Plantation owners used various criteria to determine which women were good breeders, including age, physical attributes, and fertility rates. Those who met these criteria were forced into sexual relationships with male slaves, often against their will. Throughout their pregnancies, these women were closely monitored to ensure they produced healthy offspring. Plantation owners provided better living conditions and more nourishing food to women deemed good breeders. They also received preferential treatment in terms of work assignments and punishments. This preferential treatment, however, did not change the fact that these women were still subjected to the brutal conditions of slavery. They were seen as property rather than human beings, and their bodies were treated as commodities. The story of Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman who was forced to have children with her owner, Dr. James Norcom, highlights this reality. While she was deemed a good breeder and received relatively better treatment compared to other enslaved women on the plantation, she still had to endure the horrors of forced sexual relationships. Fact number 5 underscores the dehumanization of enslaved women who were valued solely for their reproductive abilities. Their stories serve as a painful reminder of the exploitation and cruelty of the slave breeding system. Fact 6. Profitability of slave breeding. Fact number 6 reveals a chilling truth about the institution of slavery, the profitability of slave breeding. Slave owners saw it as a way to increase their wealth without the need to pay for additional labor. Slave owners meticulously kept records of the children born on their farms, noting their age, sex, and parentage. These records were used to calculate the value of their property and the potential profits to be gained from selling enslaved children. One shocking example comes from the Jamaican plantation owner, Thomas Thistlewood. Between 1750 and 1786, Thistlewood recorded over 3,000 births on his farm, with many of these children being the result of forced breeding. Thistlewood saw the breeding of enslaved people as a way to increase his wealth, noting that all slaves are profitable, but breeding women more so than men. Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, two slave traders in Alexandria, Virginia, also recognized the profitability of slave breeding. They made a fortune buying and selling slaves and engaged in the breeding of enslaved people. Franklin is estimated to have fathered over 600 children with female slaves in his possession, all destined to be sold or traded for profit. Advertisements for slave auctions often highlighted the breeding capabilities of enslaved women, with phrases like prolific breeders or good breeders being used to describe them. These advertisements served as a stark reminder of the inhumane and exploitive nature of the slave trade. The profitability of slave breeding underscores the deep-seated racism and economic interests that fueled the institution of slavery. Enslaved people were not regarded as human beings with families, cultures, and histories, but as sources of labor, bought and sold like commodities. Fact 7. Doctors' complicity in the breeding system. In fact number 7, we delve into the role of doctors in overseeing the breeding of enslaved people and their complicity in the horrors of the system. While it may seem paradoxical for doctors, who are supposed to be healers, to oversee the breeding of enslaved people, this was a common practice on many plantations during the antebellum period. Plantation owners would hire doctors to ensure that enslaved women were healthy enough to breed and to treat any medical issues that arose during the breeding process. Unfortunately, the care provided was not out of concern for the well-being of enslaved people, but rather to ensure they could produce more enslaved individuals for the profit of plantation owners. Some doctors went further, conducting experimental surgeries on enslaved women without anesthesia, believing that enslaved people did not experience pain in the same way as white individuals. One such notorious figure was Dr. J. Marion Sims, often called the father of modern gynecology. Sims performed surgeries on enslaved women in the mid-1800s, including surgeries to repair fistulas. These surgeries were conducted without anesthesia, causing immense suffering. The notion that enslaved people did not experience pain as others do was used to justify the inhumane medical experiments conducted on them. The involvement of doctors in this system highlights the pervasive dehumanization of enslaved people, where their suffering and pain were disregarded for economic gain. Fact 8. High infant mortality rate on sex farms. Fact number 8 exposes a heartbreaking reality on sex farms. High infant mortality rates. Enslaved women on these farms endured not only the horrors of forced breeding, but also inadequate nutrition and health care, leading to the deaths of many infants. While enslaved women were considered valuable for their reproductive abilities, their living conditions were far from ideal. They were subjected to grueling hours of labor in the fields, leaving them with little time to care for their babies. The infants born on sex farms often suffered from malnutrition, sickness, and neglect. These babies, born into a world of suffering, faced a grim future. The women on sex farms had no access to proper medical care to help them or their newborns. The lack of health care and nutritious food contributed to the high rates of infant mortality. The dire situation is exemplified by the case of the Louisiana State Penitentiary, also known as Angola Prison, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The prison had a large population of enslaved women who were forced to work on a sex farm. These women were subjected to brutal treatment, given little food and water, and denied proper medical care. They were forced to give birth in filthy conditions, leading to an astonishing infant mortality rate of 75%. This means that out of every 4 infants born on the farm, only 1 survived. The suffering endured by these women and their children is a chilling reminder of the inhumane conditions they were subjected to. In our next fact, we will explore the disturbing continuation of slave breeding and sex farms even after the abolition of slavery. Fact 9. Post-abolition persistence of slave breeding. Fact number 9 reveals a disturbing truth. The practice of slave breeding and sex farms persisted even after the abolition of slavery. While the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery in 1865, it did not prohibit the practice of slave breeding or the sexual exploitation of former slaves. Evidence suggests that some parts of the South continued these practices well into the early 20th century. The persistence of slave breeding was due, in part, to the fact that many former slaves continued to work on the same plantations where they had been enslaved, often still subjected to the same exploitative and abusive conditions. One well-known case of post-abolition slave breeding occurred in Natchez, Mississippi, between the late 1860s and the early 1900s. Wealthy white planters in the area engaged in a system of fancy trade, where they bought and sold young, light-skinned African-American women specifically bred for their physical appearance and sexual appeal. These women, known as fancy girls, were often the daughters of mixed-race slaves and were sold at auction for exorbitant prices. They were then forced into sexual relationships with white plantation owners and their male guests, and their offspring were often sold back into the slave trade. In addition to the fancy trade, there were reports of forced sexual relationships between white plantation owners and their former female slaves. This was facilitated by the fact that many former slaves continued to live and work on the same plantations where they had been enslaved, still often subjected to the same abusive treatment. The persistence of these practices even after the abolition of slavery highlights the deep-seated racism and economic interests that underpin the institution of slavery. Fact 10. Justifications and defenses of slave breeding. Our final fact delves into the justifications and defenses of slave breeding, offered by some slave owners and supporters of slavery. Despite the horrific and exploitative nature of slave breeding and sex farms, many defended these practices as necessary for the economic prosperity of the American South. They argued that breeding enslaved people was crucial for the plantation economy's success, as it provided a source of labor without the need to import new slaves from Africa or other regions. For example, in his 1857 book, The Impending Crisis of the South, Southern writer and politician Hinton Rowan Helper defended the practice of slave breeding as an essential economic strategy. He believed that raising enslaved people for the Southern market had proven to be a lucrative and profitable business. Similarly, U.S. Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina defended the practice in a speech delivered in 1850. Hammond argued that the breeding of enslaved people was a more cost-effective way of acquiring labor than other alternatives. He considered it a necessary strategy for the economic success of the Southern states. These justifications, however, failed to acknowledge the inhumane and exploitative nature of the practice. Enslaved people were reduced to mere sources of labor, with little regard for their basic human rights, dignity, or autonomy. By treating enslaved people as commodities and perpetuating this exploitative system, slave owners and their supporters further entrenched the system of inequality and injustice that continues to affect Black Americans today. Acknowledging these dark chapters in history and understanding the systemic racism and exploitation that underpin them is essential for working towards a more just and equitable society. We must remember the suffering endured by enslaved people on sex farms and strive to dismantle the systems of inequality that persist to this day. Let this knowledge be a call to action, a call to strive for justice, equality, and the respect of every individual, regardless of their background. We owe it to the countless individuals who suffered on these sex farms and in the institution of slavery.